Hey everybody, and welcome to this first Meet the Experts webinar from PlaytestCloud. My name is Jake, and I work with PlaytestCloud here out in Berlin. So for those of you who don't know, PlaytestCloud is a service which provides real insight to players real insight to player behaviors. Players will go in, they'll test their games in their natural environments and think aloud while playing. And PlaytestCloud captures the screen, microphone, and all gestures to give studios a full picture of how players behave and feel while gaming. As you'll see here in our chat, feel free to say hello, maybe let us know who you are and maybe where you're coming from. So for instance, Jake from Berlin would be a good way to say hello. As well, you'll notice up here as well, we have a tab for Q&A. So if you have any questions or anything during the webinar, those are completely welcome. We want as many questions as possible. So just go on over to the Q&A section, type out a question, and if we have time, we'll answer some of the best questions that we get from this webinar. But in our first episode today, in our Meet the Experts series, we have a guest, Gareth Lloyd. Gareth is an independent UX research consultant, and he offers experience in the gaming industry, nonprofit, and private sectors. He's provided player experience in many different services to many studios, including some AAA studios as well. He's an expert in competitive testing, and we're excited to have him on the show today. Gareth, did I miss anything in your introduction there?
You didn't. Hi, Jake. Hi, everyone.
Well, perfect. Well, today's topic that we're going to kind of discuss is competitor testing. And the thing that we find here at PlaytestCloud is competitor testing is one of the most underutilized tools in the playtesting tool belt. So I guess, Gareth, kind of my first question is, what are the values in running a competitor test? Is it solely just looking at a competitor's game to better your game, or is there a little bit more to that?
No, I think one of the reasons we picked this topic to talk about is that I absolutely love competitor analyses. It's one of my favorite things to do. I think it's a really amazing tool to have in your belt in terms of playtesting and studying a game, and in terms of the research processes that you can actually do with a game. And when you mentioned about using it, solely looking at a competitor's game to better your own game, that's the main principle, yeah. But in practice, there's loads of good arguments for doing one. The main one is approaching that comparison process from a UX and player experience perspective, and doing it from a systematic perspective as well. So you're picking out good practice to adopt, and you're identifying bad practice to avoid. But the other good argument for it is that it's really good for cutting down iteration cycles for you early on in the research process. It's really quick. It's fairly cheap in terms of cutting down on cycles, and it's a really effective way of getting your player experience up to speed early on in development. But there's other benefits as well that we'll talk about as we go on.
Perfect. And you mentioned as well kind of the UX UI side. There's also this other side as well, benchmarking. What's the difference between the two, and what are really the pros and cons of running a benchmarking study versus running a UX UI kind of study?
I'm going to get into my list here in my head in terms of answering that question. I sort of have a list of different ways that you can actually carry out a kind of competitor analysis here. There's loads of different ways to do it. So benchmarking is one of them. The UX UI version is also one of those as well. So I'll sort of go through them, and we'll go through the benefits and the downsides of each one as we go through. So I think they go from the very informal to the very formal. So you're trying to compare your game against another game or another series of games. You start from the most informal to the most formal. And the most informal way of doing it would be something like just an informal set of reviews, sitting down with your team, maybe a group of people that you want to be involved in the process, sharing notes about competitors, playing them in your own time, just talking them through. So the most informal way of doing this, no structure, you're just sort of saying, hey, we've all played this, let's compare it. The next step up from there is, I think I'm calling it a sort of a content and market analysis, I suppose. So you'd be looking at review scores, you'd be looking at the text of reviews, you might even be looking at community and social media content, you'd be looking at sentiment in there. You might even commission things like sample reviews and sit down and go through those and say, hey, the sample review of our game said this aspect of it didn't work, but in the competitor they said it did work. You can do that with forum, reviews, that kind of thing. You can do it with Steam reviews, etc. Then we get into the more formal researchy stuff. So there's a UX expert analysis where you have an individual with games user research experience going through, applying heuristics, sort of saying, hey, this game does this really well versus this game that does it this way. We think this is probably the best way of doing this. This seems to be bad practice and is causing barriers. That's one way of doing it. The other thing you can do is bring in the player voice, so you can actually bring in players in that process itself. So you could run a series of UX playtests on your game versus competitors, or just competitors, and compare them and find out what works and what doesn't work. Then you get into sort of more appreciation stuff. So before now, it's also qualitative. You're delving in and like extracting results from qualitative data. Now you can start doing a bit of quantitative to look at appreciation. So you can run surveys. You can maybe start to pull out metrics and start to look at how well the game is liked versus a different kind of sort of game. You can say, were you frustrated? Were you confused? Scale of 1 to 10, compare, for example. Something you can also do there is compare the UX competitor. Well, you can combine the UX analysis with the appreciation analysis. You might do a UX analysis that has a survey at the end, and then you get a bit of both. You do UX analysis of like 5 videos, you analyze the data from 20 players, great. Then you have the kind of benchmarking thing. And benchmarking is I'm not going to say it's a controversial term, it's sort of, there's ups and downs to it. I've seen it used really well, I've seen it used not so well in other places. And the reason I think it's more tricky is that actually formally benchmarking something, if you have like a psychology background, as I do, if you're formally coming up with questions that are solid and reliable, have been subject to all kinds of solid tests and analyses, that's what I want from a benchmarking analysis. I want to feel really confident that the questions I'm asking about one game are comparable on another one. We will probably talk more about benchmarking in the rest of the session, but that kind of lays out the very informal to the most formal, I think, in a very long-winded way.
Well, it's kind of interesting too. It seems like benchmarking is kind of important in a lot of different reasons. And you said as well, you've seen it used well and not so well on some points. Could you maybe talk about, in broad sense, an example of a way where a game or something has been greatly influenced by benchmarking, and really where the use can kind of come out?
So I think benchmarking is really good when you've got genuine decision making between alternatives to make. So you've got 3 different options for which way you want to go, and you're trying to decide which of those you actually want to implement, or which one do you want to be the top priority, for example. You've got limited time to develop features in a game. Which one are you going to do first? And benchmarking is incredibly helpful there. It might be based on questions that you've asked before that are effective and helpful in making those decisions. And what it does in that case is provide some sort of evidence, I guess, some actual some evidence that you can feel confident about in terms of what you think players actually think of a feature, or an art style, or something like that. Benchmarking is not so useful in exposing things like UX issues or misunderstandings, or how players get into the meat of playing a game, I suppose. That's where you get into the UX analysis comparisons and picking out things that work well and don't work so well. You can't really do that with benchmarking so much.
And I guess kind of a good question too is, and I'll remind everybody as well, I posted in the chat, if anybody has any questions during this, we're happy to answer those as well. We'll kind of keep talking, but if anybody has any direct questions, we're always happy to kind of talk about topics you want to as well. But kind of with this, both any type of competitor testing, benchmarking, or maybe UI, UX, at what point is it really the optimal time to begin competitor testing? Should it really be before development and kind of deciding, okay, where are the the corners of the market that's really not being fulfilled or not being solved, the middle while you're kind of really designing, or even after, once you have a game to say, okay, here's my successful game, here's my successful competitor, how do I compare? When's the correct time to really do a test like this?
I mean, I was going to give a sort of a bland answer here, like, oh, there's always a good time to do it. But actually, no. Yeah, I would say that the most impactful times to do it, I think, are before an early development. So, like, it's the UX research equivalent of discovery, I suppose, where you're sort of in pre-development, pre-prototyping, all of that. Or maybe you started prototyping. I think those are the times to do it. It's the most effective to carry out competitor analysis. But that's not to say that it's not really useful at other times as well. There's something really useful about running a competitor analysis when you've got a prototype that you're able to just sort of to really boil it down to the features that you think the game has working at the moment and compare those with other games. It's also pretty good to do it when you've got a more polished product as well. So you can actually say, here's our polished product, here's their polished product. Let's compare these and look at the points between what's working and what's not working. And getting players in and saying, oh God, people are failing at the onboarding stage with our game, and their game is working better. So actually that has turned out to be quite a hit all points answer in the end. But you do have that alternative then. You have the alternative of doing it much later on in development cycles as well. Like, for example, you might want to do it when you've got a big update to do. You might want to refresh it in terms of good practice that's emerged since you actually released the game. You want to completely refresh the UI, for example, or you want to change up the onboarding procedure. They're also really useful as postmortems as well, but we might talk more about that later on.
Yeah, exactly. I think we will definitely hit on those points as well, especially postmortems are so important as well, just to kind of look at a game in that kind of aspect. We actually have a question here from Chris. He talks about, you mentioned earlier that benchmarking isn't great at understanding UX issues or player comprehension. Would you mind expanding on that a little bit?
Sure. So I'm thinking about what I was considering earlier was use of sort of standardized tools. Like I love some of the UX surveys and tools that are out there, things like the SAS, the system usability scale, for example. Great for benchmarking. Your tool, it's used by the UK government to benchmark their tools versus that kind of thing. And there's a couple of similar tools that people have tried to come up with for games as well, for example. I'm guessing that some of you guys in the call here have got your own internal tools that you use for these kind of things that you developed internally. But what I think they do, and they're really good for, is highlighting red flags, instances where players aren't getting something. They're not, that something's wrong, for example, like they're finding something inconsistent, or they were stopped by something, or there was a barrier. They're not so good for actually working out what the problem is in those cases, I think. Other people might have different experiences with that. There might be really good benchmarking tools out there that I've not used that can do that better. And maybe standardized questions as well that you ask in terms of free text. But sorry if anyone can hear a baby in the background.
No, it's all good.
Incredibly.
Prove it.
Yeah, that's how we all work now. It's the kid on the BBC News walking in the background in his walker.
Oh gosh, yeah.
But it's combining them with actual qualitative data is perfect a lot of the time. So you use the benchmarking scores and things to pick up the red flags, and then you find them in the videos, for example, and that works really well sometimes.
Now, it's important to kind of distinct a little bit here too. Is it really fair to compare your game against an industry leader, especially if you are, just have a prototype or you're just beginning? Is it fair to compare to the top of the app store in your category to your game that's just a prototype or something you're just launching recently?
Yeah, I think it totally is, and part of that is the distinction between usability testing and appreciation testing. Of course, if your game is like you've been building it for a week and you're putting it up against the number one in the App Store, I don't think players are going to say your game's as good as what's in the reader. But actually, even at that stage, it's really useful to pull out usability issues, and that's not about your game being not as good as the other game. I mean, the UX good and bad practice that's in those games is absolutely rich pickings. Like, you might not be creating something with the same production values even, but you can absorb the low effort, high impact stuff that's in those games. So you can look in and say, oh look, they've done it this way. Let's do it that way. Let's steal that. Let's stand on the shoulders of giants there. And these are games that have been endlessly iterated on and improved. So steal it, use it. Use the things that work well and take them. It's not about your game taking a kicking versus other games. It's about like picking out the good practice.
Yeah, and I guess it's kind of a good point too to kind of bring up now. We're currently working on a PlaytestCloud app here at PlaytestCloud, and really what this will do is it will allow players to playtest your game or a competitor's game on a game directly downloaded from the App Store. Players will install this app, and then we record everything on their screen from them downloading the game to playing the game, and you can kind of directly go into actually viewing players using PlaytestCloud's platform. It's currently in a closed beta, so we are hopefully going to be launching it sometime soon. But feel free to reach out to us. At the end, I'll give an email address. It's hello@playtestcloud.com, or just anywhere on our website. Reach out to us if you want to join our waitlist, and we'll reach out as soon as it's available. I guess kind of a question too, kind of talking about going into like a game that is fully fledged out versus kind of your game as it's kind of growing and beginning. Is it worth really testing things such as like flow or emotion or something like that in a game, or should you really just be looking at the big data?
This is why I don't want to be, controversial about these things, but they're as a sort of a games user researcher, they're things that I don't find so much use in on a day-to-day basis, but I really recognise that they're incredibly useful in other senses. Because so there's a couple of sides to it. One is that I'm not always 100% convinced that either that they're well studied enough to be robust, that I'm happy deploying them like in large scale studies, but I also worried that they're sometimes not universal enough. Like even the concept of flow and in the zone sometimes it doesn't help me with the usability side of things. It doesn't help me with the evaluative side of things so much either. But for me, it's about how well do terms like this and concepts like that describe what your design intent is. Now, if flow accurately describes what you're trying to make your players feel, then great. It's the thing to use in that case. And again, in the zone and trying to evaluate whether players are like in a certain state of mind when they're playing your game. But I was kind of urge a bit of caution in it. Are there better ways to ask that question and more specific ways to ask it? Don't rely on received knowledge in terms of these words meaning the things that you think they mean, I guess. The example that always comes back to me is the Connect research example, where the research team was all white, took it to a show, and it didn't work with darker skin. And the problem was they were sort of asking the wrong questions there. They because they weren't able to verify that the measures that they were using and the metrics they were using actually worked with the whole range of data that they were going to get back. It gave them bad findings. And I think that's entirely possible to happen with survey questions of a certain type as well. Like when you assume that a word like flow means what you think it does, you're possibly setting yourself up for trouble later on if players don't actually think it means that. However, with that said, I think the thing to do when you're using terms like that is add supplemental questions that ask it in a slightly different way, that load onto it in the same way. So So, for example, if you're assessing flow, ask, how did you feel when you were playing this game? Did you feel like did you feel like you weren't able to think about other things? Did you think about the game when you weren't playing the game? That kind of thing. Did you find all that kind of thing? And if it all comes together and it all points to the fact that actually it does sound like you're assessing something like flow here, awesome, great. It's about assumptions. It's sort of not assuming that things mean the same to you as they do to respondents.
Yeah, and I think, you kind of talk about received knowledge. And I guess my kind of question too is something that we see people are concerned about often when they're kind of running a competitor study is avoiding kind of cherry picking evidence to already support the findings that you wanted to make. To go in and say like, okay, I have these pre-received ideas about the game that I'm about to test, and then you go in and actually test a competitor's game with these ideas and go on and look for those kind of things. How do you kind of avoid cherry picking evidence to actually support your claims, to actually go in and look at a game for what it is and actually get something that's real and scientific?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's going to be difficult because a lot of the times you're going to have emotional investment in the games that you're building, like being half science, half creativity, maybe somewhere, maybe not half and half, however you think that it's broken down. It's always going to be tough to not cherry pick in those cases, because you're going to have a thing. Often you or someone else on the team will have something that you want to do, or either a feeling that the thing that works, and a lot of the time that's right. Like it's sometimes it's inspiration and creativity that tells you what the right thing to do is. But sometimes when it comes to actually getting data to support it, it can be then tricky to marry those two things up. Your creativity, like, plus data, what's the right way to do it? Like, I think about the metaphor of musicians sometimes. You don't get musicians making decisions about what a song should do based on like the data from the user. Maybe they should. Maybe some of them do, but that's out there. So I think the ways to get around it are, I think, there's a couple of ways. One of them is the easiest one would be to work with somebody external or independent. Not always easy, like not always cheap either. Or you have a trained, maybe dedicated UX researcher on your team somewhere. It might not have to be a person whose entire job that is. Someone who has got a real interest in it and is able to push the rigorous voice in there. But also the other side of that is not just having the external researcher or the internal researcher available. It's empowering them to actually feed into decision making. So not just having them do the research and say, here it is, there you go, here's your decisions, now I'm washing my hands of it kind of thing. It's getting them in and having them being part of the decision-making process and then iterating and testing on the decisions that they've helped to make. The final option is, the DIY one. There are a lot of people who would say that you should never DIY your player research. I think that's not practical in some cases. I think there's indie and solo devs out there who have to DIY it. And if you are going to do that, it's finding ways to be rigorous, I suppose. So get yourself involved in games use research discussions, look at research frameworks, and try and find things that you can lean on to help detach yourself from the game, which is incredibly hard because it's your game.
Exactly. It's always really hard to kind of detach yourself from something that you spend hours, weeks, months on, where you're very much invested. So it's always really important to try to remove bias. And I mean, that's really the great thing about running playtests, is you can actually step away and, typically when you playtest on your own, if you're just having somebody come in, you give them pizza, you say, play my app, you're watching them, they're your family, they're your friends, they're not going to give you real feedback. And that's kind of the cool thing with PlaytestCloud. If I can do a selfless plug right here, but so we actually will invite players to play your games who have no direct contact to you, have no experience. They just play your game and they will tell you how it is from the get-go, and they won't hold anything back. So that's really kind of the cool thing, to be able to test your game and also test a competitor's game as well, to get an unbiased kind of person to look at it. You mentioned in that last response, we'll kind of go on both ends, both the DIY method and also kind of talking about an external independent researcher. That's actually how we know you. You're one of our researchers that go in and, when a team comes in and says, hey, we have a specific need for something and we want to hire an outside games user researcher, you're one of the guys that we call. We have you on speed dial. But when you actually start with a client who says, hey, I want to run a test with a competitor, what are the first kind of questions that you ask and kind of talk with them to really decide what kind of test you want to make and really which direction you want to head?
So for me, I like to come at it from a couple of angles. I like to have some guidance from them, and I like to have some clean slate. So let's talk about competitor analyses specifically. So comparing more than one game. The most important thing for me there is that I'm able to boil let's say we've got two games, that I can boil them down to their sort of constituent elements a bit. So let's say it's a puzzle game, for example. Yep. But let's say they're completely different types of puzzle game. What are the common elements between those two puzzle games? It will usually be things like onboarding, pre-game, post-game rewards, and metagame, for example. So that's the sort of like just boiling it down in my head there, what it could look like. But actually, when you get into some of these different genres of games, sometimes it's not that at all. The structure of a like whole different genre can be something else, like visual novel versus first-person shooter versus puzzle game, for example.
True.
So part of my first process would be to play those games and try to boil them down in terms of what they are, and how then I would start comparing those elements between the different games. Then it's the other element that you do need to be guided by the developer and the client themselves. Like, you have to answer the questions that they need to actually find out from the research itself. So part of that might be like some people that I talk to know exactly what they're looking for. They can say, we want to find out this, we want to compare these two sets of assets, we want to find out whether the tutorial is working, that kind of thing. Other times they're not so sure. They want to have a bit of back and forth about what are the things that they can actually get from the research itself. Sometimes they just know they want to do some research, but they aren't quite clear on what it is that they want to look at. So I don't even know if I'm answering this question properly here.
No, this was really great.
There's going to be a few of those. But it is this dual process of coming in from a blank slate, trying to stay unbiased from that aspect, but also being guided by what it is that they're trying to find out about the game at this time, anyway.
Perfect. And then I guess kind of the other end of that as well is if let's say you met somebody at a dinner party and they're a one-man band, they're looking to do a competitor testing and they really just don't have the resources to hire an external researcher. Is there a specific tip or anything you would do a little differently in that kind of circumstance?
So if I was actually going to be, if they got me, if it was a mate who said, "Can you do this for me? Come on, just do this one time." Yeah, I would. Well, actually, no. I would probably take that exact same approach about even a game in that perspective. It would be, what are you trying to do? What is your intent with this game? What are you trying to? What do you need me to find out from the research? And it would be coming at it from a blank slate, not a mate's game. It would be just a game. How do I look at this in a completely unbiased and like looking at it a player would for the first time when they see it. There was another question there that I was going to ask as part of that. Was there another question?
That's okay. We can jump over to, we actually have quite a few questions coming in from our audience. And I guess the first one here on the list is Daniel asked, would you suggest not only to test direct competitor games with very similar concept, but also competitors within a broader scope? So
good question. Yeah. So if you stay very narrow, you will get very specific UX guidance. So, for example, let's say you've got 2 solitaire games. Like you find a game really similar to the game that you want to compare against. Probably they're going to be doing very similar things. They're going to have, like, as I said before, they'll have free game. They'll let you select, like, they'll have energy systems. They'll have all of this stuff, like a free-to-play solitaire game, for example. And if you do that, you will be able to break down, look, game 1 does this way. This is what the map screen looks like, or the level select screen looks like. This is what level select screen looks like on game B, for example. So you'll get very specific data back about how they do things differently. If you go more widely, you won't get that same specific comparison data, but you will get a wider range of practice. You'll get different ways of doing things. Some of them might be better, some of them might be worse. It's sometimes really nice if you compare one really similar game and one slightly out there game, one very slightly different one in the same genre, but, like, trying to achieve some of the same things and with the same demographic groups, for example.
And I guess that kind of jumps into another audience question that we have is, this is from Julian. He says, are there various methods to kind of figure out which target group is the right group to kind of test your game? How do you kind of decide what is the target group of this category, and then figure out what is your target that you want to actually test with?
In fairness, that's an area where I'm usually really guided by developers. In terms of, I would ask, who is it that they're trying to target, and have that conversation of, are you very locked down into that specific group of people that you want to target with it? And do you want the game to only be for those people? Or do you want it to, have you got the urge to make it appeal to a wider range of players than that? In terms of methods to actually elicit it, I find that very tricky from my perspective anyway. One thing that you could be doing is, we're starting to talk about different things here rather than competitive analyses, but would be running sort of true discovery work, like, for example, from the UX side of things. So not even so much games user research, like proper UX discovery, where you go out there, you interview a range of players, of users, you find out what the right questions are, you interview people in all the different groups you think that could be useful, that could be relevant, that could give you interesting findings. And then you might want to run a bigger survey, for example, to verify some of the things you found in that. And maybe that's where you start like narrowing down who your target audiences are. And you start running playtests and competitive analyses with them. Yeah, but I'm sorry, that's not a more comprehensive.
No, it's a great answer. And I kind of really, it's always really important with, running competitor test or with whatever test you want to run. It's very important to kind of decide what your target audience is, or even, do you want to have a target audience? We could even run a test with just random people as well. But it's always important to kind of figure out, okay, who's going to play my game and who's going to play this competitor's game, and kind of narrow that in, so you can kind of narrow in your kind of range and your audience range that really is going to be important when you launch your game. So I guess we have another question here as well. So would you recommend testing a competitor's game in a way that's indistinguishable from how you would test your own game? So, for instance, the same directions given to testers, etc. Or is it more valuable to focus on specific feature distinctions between their game and your game? And if, I guess it is, you should be focusing on distinctions, how would you avoid bias in that kind of way?
Yeah, this is going back to the to the standardized questions stuff here. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
So ideally, you'd have an instrument out there that applied to all games. Like it was perfect. It applied to, it would evaluate a puzzle game in the same way that it evaluated a shoot 'em up, like from the on a Commodore 64, for example. But it doesn't exist. That scale isn't out there. It doesn't work. You can't do it because games are so different, obviously. And any questions that did apply so well to both of those, like, for example, was it frustrating? Was it confusing? Was it fun? It's not that useful, really, just having those questions in there. It doesn't tell you how to fix those games. It just tells you that the game isn't fun and it's confusing. And that is useful in some respects. It tells you whether you're on the right track or not, but it doesn't really get into the meat of what things you do want to be fixing and how you want to fix them. It's sort of a bespoke versus standardized testing question here. Now, ideally, what you do is you have two games. You would try to eke out what is standard between those two games, and what questions can you ask that will apply equally well to both of them, and try to strike a balance between being specific to the games themselves and consistent between the two games as well. So it might be, for example, that you can come up with the same set of questions, but you just have to change the names of terminology in there, for example. So like maybe energy is called one thing, or your free-to-play time mechanic is called one thing in one game versus another one. So you just change those names, for example. And then you're pretty close to having something that's comparable between the two games. If you have two completely different surveys, you're sort of in a bit of trouble there, I think, because how are you going to compare them? So it's finding out what questions are comparable and how useful are they. Now, when it comes to the qualitative side of things, it's much easier because it's about what are the things that the two games do share. So where are the barriers, for example, in the first 10 minutes of play? Where are the barriers in the first half an hour? What kind of experiences are players having when they get in the game, kind of thing? Are they looking confused in one game versus like just playing through smooth and absolutely fine in the second game? Are they bored? Are they obviously bored when they get to like the fifth game or something? Yeah, it's easier when it comes to the qualitative side of it, weirdly.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of opens up a little bit of a topic as well, where you see a lot of these standard usability services in the market to actually run a test like this. Do those actually have any value or substance to them?
I think it's really new, actually. It's sort of, I think they're doing things in some cases it's clearly very clever under the hood that I don't quite understand in some cases. And I've read lots of sort of very well-reasoned research in the past by researchers like the guy whose name I can never pronounce. Markuszewski, I think his name is. Like incredibly well-reasoned research about different player types and ways to break down how different players act in different settings and what the different motivations are and how that impacts the experiences of a game, for example. It doesn't impact so much on usability issues for me. I think for me that's more kind of the market research side of things, and in terms of whether a game's going to be successful in terms of hitting different demographics and motivations and aiming it towards different players. It's less my kind of wheelhouse a bit. So I don't want to really say anything against those services. I think there might be stuff in there that can make specific recommendations about what the game should be to help it appeal to a much wider range of people. I just don't think they're usability issues most of the time. I think good usability is fairly universal, I think. Sometimes you can have usability issues that are aimed at different demographics, like usability issues for so-called, I don't even like saying casual players versus like hardcore day-to-day PC shooter players, for example. The usability approaches will be different for those two people. But really, good usability at its core, there are universal characteristics between those two in terms of how you present text and how you present calls to action and how you present rewards, that kind of thing. But that's different to those services, I think. Sorry, not particularly useful response there in terms of I don't have an insight into how they're working, but they claim to be effective. I just don't know how they're working, and I don't know what they do.
Yeah, it's important to acknowledge it as well. I mean, these kind of standard usability kind of services and surveys are, they're out there in the industry, and they're good for some cases, and they're not good for other cases. I think it just kind of depends on really what you're looking for and what you really need and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
We actually have a question here from Mia as well.
Yeah.
Do you have some typical exact questions that you would ask in a survey of a competitor benchmark playtest? That's like a good example.
So I usually actually would ask questions about emotions and feelings that the player had during the study. Things like, did you experience any confusion? Did you have fun? Were you frustrated? I think is always a good one, because frustration is such a good question, but it's a very negative emotion. Like, usually if someone says that they are frustrated, they are probably not having a great time. Not always, which is why it's always great to elicit actually what's going on in those responses. I have actually seen a couple of people who say that they were frustrated in a good way, which really put the cat among the pigeons for a week for me. For that, like, can I even rely on that as a consistent measure? So measuring emotions is one. Measuring confusion is one. In surveys, a couple of free text responses about things that have confused players is a good one. One of the things that I lean on quite heavily in competitor, actually in all kinds of surveys, is a statement matrix of agreement. So just statements that you want players to feel about the game. For example, like it was clear when I could do X. I knew what this symbol meant, for example. And they're not things that are always. You can't share those between two games sometimes, but you can actually boil some of those questions down to working across multiple games. So, like, trying to think of a good example here. I understood the value of the rewards that I was getting. It's always a good one. I knew when I was playing against other players for multiplayer games. Like, one of the most common issues in sort of Clash of Clans alike is, am I against a bot or am I against another person here? So it's always a fun one to ask in that kind of game. Like, that's universal in that kind of setting. But unfortunately, they are kind of genre linked. But the universal ones are the emotional ones, like frustrated, bored, confused, that kind of thing. Or another great one is I didn't understand something. I didn't understand something during the tutorial. The tutorial taught me everything that I needed to know. The tutorial didn't teach me everything that I needed to know, because that's specific, but also generalizable between more than one game, because they both got a tutorial, presumably.
Yeah, and I guess kind of talking about these like survey questions and that sort of thing, we were talking beforehand, and you were always kind of complaining about these free text answers and having to kind of go through and, somebody writes in a paragraph and you have to kind of start categorizing it. Do you think that free text is worth the time and effort that really does it give you value out of like the time and effort that you really have to go to analyze it, or should you really keep it towards check boxes, pick 1 out of the 5, give them a scale of 1 to 10, keep it more narrowed?
That is the thing. It's time versus effort. Like, it's really tempting to have everything in as a free text box, like, because you think you're going to get the best data from the most detail that players can give. Two issues are that people aren't great at actually writing in their responses a lot of the time. And the other is that it is so much more time consuming from the researcher's perspective. There are ways to, and I'm probably teaching you guys things that here. There are ways to turn qualitative data into usable categorized data. So you go through adding tags. You use formal qualitative software to actually tag whether there's something in there. Like you would do a form of thematic analysis going through. You'd say you have one run through the data and say these are all the tags that I'm seeing in there. Then you have another run through where you apply them. Then you go back and check that all of the responses are accounted for in some way there, that you hit 90%. Great, all done. You've turned it into useful quantitative data there. Even though what I've just said is sacrilege in some research areas, where turning qualitative data into number data is right out the window. But actually what you're trying to do is turn it into meaningful, proportional data. How many people said that they were having a terrible time, for example. And you can do things like run sentiment analyses. Can be useful. Things like Qualtrics can do that for you quite well. They can say, give you a score based on how good or bad the text was. It's all right. Doesn't really give you specifics in terms of what the user's saying there, though. And sometimes when you go in and look at those responses, they're not quite as clear cut as the 86% positive figure that you're seeing says. I've forgotten the question again now. I've just been talking.
No, we're kind of going on, is free text survey really valuable in that kind of way? Or
I don't know if I'm coloring this myself here, because it in terms of me being a consultant, it bumps my time that I'm spending on the research up by days, which is more expensive, obviously. And I just don't know if there's the bang for buck is actually including those things. A couple of really well placed questions there is great, it's perfect. And you find that if you have just a couple of questions, players want to give you better responses in those ones. If you've got 50 of them, the responses you get in those are going to be awful, because they're fatigued from actually writing stuff in there. But it's not laziness. It's not on my part. That's time that could be spent probably pulling better things out of data that's on a Likert scale, for example, from agree to disagree. So I would say they have their uses, but use sparingly, I think, unless you love coding data.
Yeah, and I think kind of talking about the Likert scale and that sort of thing, if anybody is unfamiliar on really how to kind of formulate a good survey question, we have some really good resources on our blog. You can head over to PlaytestCloud.com. We have a whole blog that kind of works with people to really help them understand and become expert game user researchers, even if you're starting from the ground level. So that's really a good resource if anybody's looking for that. And two, you kind of mentioned as well, if you're going to have players answer 50 questions and that sort of stuff, really when you have players go out and start typing things out, nobody really wants to continue typing and doing all this kind of stuff. It's much better when they can actually speak aloud. So that's one of the really cool things that we offer here at PlaytestCloud is you can kind of mix and match your playtest types. So if you want to run any sort of test, competitor or not kind of test, and say, I want to match it with a concept test, which is basically a survey where people speak aloud. They go through, you show images with just text that says, hey, what do you think about X or Y? Give us your opinion. Or they go through and actually view images as well, where they can go in and see an image and just talk aloud. And it's almost like a audio-visual survey rather than an actual survey. So that's a really good tool to know that is in the PlaytestCloud tool belt. But kind of jumping right back to concept testing and kind of the topic of the day, how do you really go about finding a niche that your competitor has missed and you want to maximize on when you run one of these concept tests?
That is certainly a tricky one, because in research it's always hard to study the absence of something. I think that sounds like a philosophical thing there, but what I mean is that it's a magic ingredient that's not present. So how do you quantify it not being there? But I think it's a great question, because it's a thing that you do want to do, and I'd say the thing that you want to do to find that would be a combination of UX competitor analysis studies and doing that much more open-ended research with players, like thinking about motivations and your intentions and how those two things fit together. What are you trying to make that doesn't fit with the norm of these other games? Is it a thing that players think is reasonable? Do they think, when you take it to them, when you prototype it and give it to them, does it seem fun? Can you do multiple prototypes? Can you get basic short studies done with these players and find out if that niche that you're trying out actually works? I mean, it's that kind of just getting ideas out there and getting them in front of people and seeing how they work. There are. It's not just mechanics, even with that kind of thing. It can be art styles, for example. Your niche could be have a game with a completely unique art style, and putting that in front of players can be a really interesting way of finding out whether it does hit a nerve in a good way, I suppose. I can't think of a good equivalent for hitting a nerve. Whether it resonates, I guess. It's about running really quite open-ended research with players before you commit to anything, I suppose, and then iterating on that and finding out where it is, or refocusing halfway through a game, for example, which is a completely common thing. I know, I've forgotten his name, Rami Ismail talks about it a lot in the work that he does about how games have pivoted. His games have pivoted from being one thing to a completely different thing halfway through, and he's done that via getting the game in front of people and looking at what things in there they actually really enjoyed. But it's a super tricky one.
Yeah, and I want to make sure too, as we're kind of winding down with the last 7 minutes here, you brought a handout earlier today. It's this document. You want to kind of tell us what this is here?
I don't actually know how old. It's a preprint from a games user research. A games user researcher has come up with that paper, and I think it's a really good primer for looking at the ins and outs of using standardized methods in games and survey scales. They go into detail on quite a few of the surveys that are out there. They talk about the GEC, the SAS, all the other ones that are out there. A couple of years ago, I went through and tried doing this job myself, and if I'd seen that this paper had been there, that job would have been a lot easier for me. I would have just nabbed all those. But they also do a really good job of laying out when it's appropriate to come up with your own scales, when you might want to use somebody else's, and all that kind of thing. In kind of trying to think through the basics of these things in terms of designing surveys and designing research, I thought it was a really good primer. So if anyone's interested in the things we've been talking about, it's a good read.
Yeah, and you can find it here on our webinar page under the handouts tab right there. I guess kind of a question too that I personally have, when we were talking about this and kind of scoping out, and I was learning a little bit more about competitor testing. Earlier, it was kind of seemed like, I kept referring to, testing my game versus another game, and you kept referring to testing my game versus another game and another game, and testing 2 or 3 other games against my game. When should I really, what's kind of the benefit of testing more than one game?
I think we did touch upon this at one point when we were saying that there was a question earlier, that was it, the question about picking a very close competitor versus going a bit further afield in terms of the competitor. Doing 2 at once, or doing more than 2, lets you have a sort of wild card in there a bit. So you can have one that you think is a sort of safe bet in terms of being close to your game, but you can have another one that might be a little bit different then, that does things slightly differently. And what you're more likely to end up with is different approaches to doing things in a usability sense, because that's what you want, really. You want the gamers to be trying to do the same things, players, but do them in a slightly different way. And the more games you're looking at, the more likely you are to get more data points in that. I think 3 is quite a nice sweet spot a lot of times for that reason of having one very close one and one slightly off the center one. But it also gives you, having 3 data points is really nice in a lot of places, because you often end up with one that doesn't work so well, one that works really well, and one in the middle. So you can you usually get a good steer on which is the best one to use. Like, trying to think of an example of what kind of thing you might be looking at, like presentation of text, for example. How does this game do it? How does this game do it? How does this game do it? If you're just comparing one versus the other, great. Maybe you say that this one works. But maybe in looking at 3, you're able to see a bad, medium, good set of examples do that. I think I said, and it might be, good, better, best. Maybe they're all pretty good at it, but at least you can see like the direction of movement from the less good to the really good when you've got 3 there. With 2, it's a bit more, apples are not like you're just picking one over the other. But when you've got 3, you've got like direction of travel.
Yeah, and I guess too, kind of my question too is, oftentimes when we kind of send somebody into a test, we tell them to, like, our players to go and focus on one thing and kind of pinpoint your findings on that. Really, when you run a longitudinal, for instance, you shouldn't, focus on everything and go in and, you're going to be analyzing the videos for hours. You should focus in on one subject, test that subject. If you have something interesting that you think that was weird, note it and maybe run a separate test on it. But does this actually apply to competitor testing? Should it be more of a shotgun method where you go in and you say, okay, I don't know where I'm going with this. I don't know what this test is really going to be about, but I'm just going to throw it out there and see what sticks? Or should we really be pinpointing on our predisposed kind of ideas and conditions about the game and test those?
That's the nice thing about competitive analysis, actually. If you're playing a game that is quite limited in scope, for example, if it's just a puzzle game that has very limited metagame and anything like that, it can be really easy to sort of take in the whole experience in some ways. You can categorize the game from day 1 to day 7, and you can break it down in terms of sections. You can come out all the bits like that. If you were doing a competitor analysis of Fortnite versus PUBG versus every other battle royale game, that is going to be incredibly tricky to do all that in taking the whole experience, because there's so much going on there. Or Final Fantasy versus Dragon Quest. It's going to be incredibly tricky to encompass the whole experience of those games. But in those cases, it's much more appropriate to zero in on exactly what it is you want to look at. For example, the common thing is always onboarding a lot of the time. It's the thing that you might want to focus in on. You could do metagame, you could do moment-to-moment in-game stuff, all completely appropriate for focusing in on. But as I said, smaller scope games, you can usually do it all in one go. You can come in with no guidance and just do a full comparison. Bigger scope games, you usually have to zero in.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, Gareth, for joining in and kind of meeting with us today here on our first Meet the Experts webinar. We're fast approaching the end of the hour, so I want to let everybody know who's in the channel. Afterwards, I'm going to send out a survey. If anybody has any ideas for the next couple of topics, things that you want to learn more about, let me know. Write it in our survey, and we can go in and actually talk about some different topics, and we want to know what you're interested. So anyway, I want to thank everybody, though, for stopping by this hour and joining in from around the world. We have people from many different time zones joining in today. If your question didn't get answered and you have an additional question, I'm going to post an email address in here. It's just hello@playtestcloud.com. Reach out. We have plenty of time when we'd love to either have a one-on-one or just answer your question over email. Yeah, and we love talking about playtesting, and we love really working with all the different game studios that we do. So with that, I want to thank everybody for stopping by. And until next time, we look forward to speaking with you guys again soon. All right, take care.
Thanks, everyone.